Oh, perfect. Thank you very, very much. I had a little bit of Eric was going in and out a little bit, so I'm worried it might be my phone. So if that's the case, someone, send question and answer or whatever if we're if we're having any trouble hearing. So this looks like this is a period when, obviously, due to the Great Hunger in Ireland and also due to the revolutions in Europe in 1848 and other economic factors, you have a large population of surge of immigration coming in. And I think that when we think about these cycles of immigration, there are multiple factors we can talk about, and I've included a couple of pieces of information here from the Philadelphia Encyclopedia online, because they have a really rich online website that students could explore that talks a lot about how anti-immigrant sentiment played out in these areas and some of these cities. First of all, race and ethnicity has always been an issue in nativism and anti-immigrant sentiment. But I think it's also really important to talk about religion. And in the 1840s and 1850s, anti-Catholicism was really very prominent in the nativist movement, and riots were often directed at Catholic churches. And so I think for students who immediately think about immigration being about race, one of the good things to do is to emphasize how important religion was in some of these conflicts. The other thing you can see from these depictions of violence in the 1840s and 1850s is how much vigilantism and mob action was part of anti-immigrant activity. There's probably no period in U.S. history, to generalize broadly, and maybe Eric and Robert will contradict me, but there's no period where anti-immigrant sentiment is simply sort of handed down from elites, and that there are that popular native-born Americans just sort of receive that as received wisdom. It's always been something that emerges at the grassroots, often against the interests or wishes of elites. And you certainly see that in the 1840s and then the 1850s, where you see a great deal of street action and violence against immigrants. People don't think, this follows up on what Eric said earlier, but students, I think, are unlikely to think of the Irish as a different race or as a different, even really as a different ethnic group, because people from Western Europe now are all viewed as white. So this is a wonderful opportunity to challenge students to sort of see and be able to read a set of visual cues that aren't really familiar to us now. At least my students, when I show cartoons like this, they don't really know what they're looking at. But this is a sort of classic depiction of an Irish politician or an Irishman in the 1850s, and these stereotypes were rampant everywhere in sort of depicting these newcomers, not only in religious terms as Catholics who would follow allegedly the Pope rather than American democracy, and who just weren't going to be able to be voters and citizens and wouldn't be able to understand how the American Republic was supposed to work because their first loyalty would be to the Pope. And I think the caption got left off of this. It's got some sort of ethnic slang in it, but essentially what's depicted here is an Irish school commissioner, and the native-born Protestant school commissioners sitting at the table are saying, well, we've always read the Bible in our schools. That's what we should do. And this Irish commissioner who's standing over them rather menacingly says, well, Father Flaherty says it interferes with religion, and so you're not going to read the Bible in schools anymore. So you can see how central religion and the reading of the Bible in public schools was to this whole controversy over what role the Irish would play in politics and in society. The second wave that I'd like to talk about is between the 1870s and the 1910s in the so-called Gilded Age and Progressive era. And you see here how much the immigrant stream broadens out to include other parts of Europe. This is classically described as the period where people began to come from Southern Europe and Eastern Europe in very large numbers, although you'll see that people coming from Ireland and England and Germany continued to come in large numbers. One of the things that in one of the features here in Chapter 16 that we use is to help students think also that not everybody came to the United States, and maybe not everyone wanted to come to the United States. And this chart shows 4 different immigrant groups and explores really where people ended up. In the case of Swedish immigrants, almost everybody got on the boat and came to the United States. But this is an opportunity to explore with students who have taken world history, perhaps, or can think in a global context. Why is it that, say, immigrants from Britain might have chosen Canada or Oceania, that includes Australia and New Zealand primarily, or Africa, and to sort of see how the British Empire shaped immigration choices and shaped also then who came to the United States and what the population of the United States came to look like. The other immigrant groups, obviously, Italians were drawn in fairly large numbers to Latin America. And so this is a kind of way to think with students about how neither the starting point nor the arrival destination was fixed among these different groups. The one thing I really want to talk about in this period of the 1880s and 1890s is Chinese exclusion, because one of the important shifts from the earlier periods, if students are going to compare these cycles of immigration and nativism, is that the number of Chinese immigrants who were coming in the antebellum period was still relatively small and was limited to California. So Asian immigration became a very hot-button issue in California as early as the territorial period, but it really doesn't become a national issue until after the Civil War. But in the 1870s and 1880s, Chinese exclusion really becomes a dominant issue, and perceptions of Asians as racially different, as a threat to American labor, precipitated a whole new wave of vigilantism. And this is an extremely ugly cartoon about a Chinese worker, immigrant worker, putting white American boys out of work. And here they are standing on the street corner looking over at the factory, and they don't have a job. They are put out of work by someone who is perceived to be almost superhuman and subhuman at the same time in the capacity to compete in the workplace. So that adds not only race and ethnicity, religion. The Chinese were often referred to as heathens, as people who did not have Christian or Judeo-Christian background, and also class and economic competition were all issues in this period. This is from The Wasp, which was a cartoon magazine newspaper published in San Francisco. And throughout this period, although anti-Asian immigration becomes quite national in scope, it's heavily focused in the Pacific. And here we have another vivid example of how labor and working class interests particularly rose up to demand Chinese exclusion. What happens, and there's some very interesting recent work on this, is that in the election of 1880, the Republicans are still sort of lukewarm about Chinese immigration. During the period of the Civil War, Republicans really convey a desire to have the door open to Chinese immigration. But that changes as hostility to the Chinese grows, and it becomes a political liability for the Republicans. The 1882 Chinese Exclusion Act is a real watershed moment in immigration history, because for the first time, people from a particular nationality and race are excluded, and because Chinese exclusion lasts for such a long time, it's renewed over and over until finally in the middle of World War II, when the United States is dropping troops behind Japanese lines in China, and China and the United States are working as allies against Japan in World War II, is when the Chinese exclusion is finally lifted. But all the modern trappings of INS power and immigration power to exclude people not born in the United States, the legal cases that determine modern citizenship and patterns of exclusion based on ethnicity and race are really very much products of the Chinese exclusion era. And in fact, the whole idea that there ought to be a wall, not to get too topical here, but you get a sense here of the ways in which this idea of blocking people out with a wall also emerges in this period. Ironically, the border with Mexico was wide open in this period. There was really no marker at all. And so Chinese who were excluded from immigrating at ports on the Pacific coast would actually go to Mexico and try to walk through to the United States posing as Mexicans rather than as Chinese. And some of them died in the same deserts where people now trying to get into the United States from Latin America have perished. And I think that really suggests some of the ways in which students can think about continuities in nativism and immigration and also changes. So here you have the same piece of ground really contested, the same border contested, but for very different reasons, because Mexicans were welcome to walk into the United States. And in fact, Mexican workers, when Chinese exclusion really reduces and blocks Chinese immigration, that provides opportunities for Mexican workers to arrive in larger numbers. So that's one of the patterns that that helps lead to a large wave of Mexican immigration to the United States in the early 20th century. The last thing I'll say, and then turn it over to Robert, is that over the course of the so-called progressive era in the early 20th century, you begin to get the same rhetoric that has been applied to Asian immigrants applied to European immigrants, and you begin to see these calls to reduce European immigration as well. The second big marker of these cycles after the 1882 Chinese Exclusion Act that I would point to is the 1924 Naturalization Act, and those might be two good laws to have your students compare and think about what changed and what was different and the same. At the same time as the Immigration Act, this is the high, the sort of high point of the Klan. And so this period of the 1920s, again, students should see that the Klan was certainly anti-African American, and it picked up on the themes, anti-black themes of the Klan of the Reconstruction era. But the Klan of the 1920s was also very vocally anti-Semitic and also very vocally anti-Catholic and concerned to enforce prohibition. And so not only race and ethnicity, again, but also religion, and also some, in complicated ways, some issues of labor and class and economic competition, as well as vigilantism and grassroots action, sort of activism, the sense that, that there was a kind of upwelling of nativism happened again in the 1920s. I'm going to stop there and see if Robert, hand things along to Robert, who might want to talk more about the 1920s, or then take us forward from there.